Mark, I think, do we really need to introduce you? Editor of Smash Hits, editor of Q, founder of Word, editor of Select, and you still write for The Times and Elle, is that right?
I write for quite a few people, yes, but Times and Elle recently, yeah.
So I think the first question really is, you know, what was your path to becoming a music journalist?
Well, my path was that I was interested in writing, I suppose, and always been interested in writing, and used to fancy myself as some kind of a terribly pretentious novelist in a kind of Richard Brautigan style, which will mean nothing to anybody apart from Bruce, actually, who was a terrible old kind of beatnik kind of 70s writer. And I kind of thought that was the way forward. But I was also completely obsessed with music, and so I listened to music all the time. I was in various bands at school and college and stuff. And I thought that actually, and read the music press, so I thought that the perfect thing to combine the two would be to write about music. That was my romantic, ideal, to see if I could achieve that. And
so, did you start writing about music as a teenager, or was it when you went to university? At which stage did you pen your first piece about music?
Well, I didn't write. I mean, I used to write things about just notes in diaries about going to see bands, but it wasn't until I actually worked for Record Mirror in 1977 where I was. I was trying to get into Record Mirror. There were four newspapers at the time. It was the Record Mirror, the Melody Maker, the New Musical Express, and Sounds. That's right, Sounds. I couldn't remember how terrible. I forgot. Sounds with his heavy metal. Do you remember with the Cockney Rejects on the cover? And I kind of was trying desperately to get in. It was very hard because the NME had those were the only place you could write about music. There was a guy called Robin Denslow who wrote in the Guardian, still going, and that was it. And in fact, the staff of the NME, when I was there, was pretty much Charles Shaw Murray, Nick Kent, Julie Birchall, Danny Baker. Extraordinary characters. Danny Baker, incidentally, the receptionist. My first day I can remember arriving. Danny Baker was about 18, 19, and he used to answer the phone, picking up the phone going, "City Morgue, you stab them, we slab them." Didn't really matter who was on the phone, it'd be Bruce Springsteen's manager or something. But I mean, I got in because, in fact, I was invited by the Record Mirror to go and do a review of Elvis Costello and the Attractions without realising that the Record Mirror had slagged off, in the expression of the time, Elvis's first album, and that the manager had said that he would personally kill anybody from the Record Mirror who got into this venue, the Nashville Rooms in W14. And I went along to do the gig, wasn't on the guest list, managed to wangle my way in, went up afterwards to... And I ought to say I had very, very long hair at the time and a green velvet jacket, which is a very bad look for 1977. And I went backstage to do a little interview with Elvis. Because otherwise what you did as a reporter, a really keen cub reporter, my little spiral bound, saying, "Hello, so you're Elvis, and you're Steve Naive is at keyboard. How are we spelling naive? Is that E-I or I-E? This kind of thing." And the manager's got hold of me and he said, "Where are you from, mate?" I said, "I'm from the Record Mirror." And he said, he got hold of me, bashed my head against the wall. Elvis then go, "We hate the fucking Record Mirror. And we hate hippies in green velvet jackets," and just kicked me out onto the Talgarth Road. So that was my first night as a journalist. I don't know how any of you lot, because I've got a lot of journalists here today, I don't know how you got into journalism, but I hope it wasn't quite as eventful as that. And I just thought, then on the way home, I threw my velvet jacket into a bin, thinking maybe actually that was a bad idea, a velvet jacket. I had a yard of my hair cut the next morning.
And what was it like? What was the piece that you wrote then?
Well, of course, it was incredibly enthusiastic. That's a really good point. Was there any mention of mine being brutally duffed up by the manager with, mortal flesh wounds inflicted? No, it wasn't. Sort of, hard-working four-piece Elvis Costello and the Attractions played a blinder at the Nashville Rooms to, one of those classic, But yeah, it was my first piece. I was just thrilled to get in, really.
So they sent you there to review it, or were you actually meant to?
Oh no, I was meant to review it, but but that's what actually got me in. Because I went out the next day to the Record Mirror and I handed my piece, and I'd never been allowed past reception, and the whole staff came out just to look at me, kind of curiously, and I realised then what was kind of something was going on. They said, "That's great, it's a fantastic, brilliant gig." Elvis did a couple of amazing new songs, actually, unleashed upon an unsuspecting public, that kind of stuff. Roxbridge Tapestry, blah, 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 all these kind of cliches. And they said, "Any trouble?" And then I thought, I said, "Well, actually, I was, pretty much killed by the manager." And "Well, sorry, mate, we should have told you," but, and it was really sweet. And they felt so bad that I was almost murdered. And not only murdered, but murdered in front of Elvis, all the Attractions, Graham Parker, and four members of his band, The Rumour, we're going back in time here. A lot of people would remember them. And several blockheads of Ian Dury's band. So it was not just being murdered; it was being murdered very publicly in front of some quite terrifying people. And they felt so bad that they allowed me to work for them for about the next two months, and then I got a call from New Musical Express, and that's how I got in there because they saw my stuff in the record mirror.
Did you meet any of these musicians that had witnessed this assault in later years?
Well, no, I had actually, funny enough, I saw two members of the room the other day, but I wouldn't have asked them that because anybody who was in the vicinity of Jake Riviera, the manager, and we can legally say this, by the way, would have seen this going on in a fairly routine fashion. This guy was one of those kind of old school managers, there was the archetype would have been Peter Grant, who managed Led Zeppelin, which is that if you're a completely ruthless guy who kind of just terrifies everybody, then you allow your group to sit there and be the kind of freewheeling creative types that they need to be. Well, you do all the aggressive stuff, and that was his kind of plan, really.
So you got into this. I mean, just rewinding a little bit by going to getting out of school and sneaking off to music festivals. I mean, what was it? What was your first experience of that like?
Well, I went to festival. I mean, I wrote a whole chapter about a festival in 1971 in my book because I thought that it's a piece of social history now. I went to Glastonbury the first time in 1993, and I hadn't been to a festival for about, I suppose, 15 or 16 years, and I was absolutely astonished by how much they'd changed. It was just absolutely unbelievable. I mean, Glastonbury was this wonderful place, this gorgeous tented paradise which had bars, restaurants, art galleries. There was a hospital. There were clubs, there were cinemas. I mean, there were people cooking paella. There were wind-powered, solar-powered showers. And I just thought it was just absolutely unbelievable because I'd been to this festival in 1971, which I write about in great detail, because I think people ought to know what those festivals were like. They were just an absolute nightmare. Anybody here go to any festivals in the early 70s? They were just a complete nightmare. But we didn't think they were a nightmare at the time because we didn't know any better. We thought it was absolutely wonderful.
So, I mean, was this when you see people walking around and hanging out backstage and getting the royalty treatment? Did that also lead you to want to become a journalist because you saw that they might be getting to use nicer toilets or...
Well, yeah, I think later on I went to Nebworth in 1976 when the Stones were playing, and I remember looking over into the press pen and seeing all these guys who worked for Melody Maker and the NME and stuff, and thinking that looked like a really good job because they hadn't had to queue up as we had. They hadn't had to sleep in a hedge. They hadn't had. I mean, the loos, the latrines at Wembley, which is trenches with a wobbling scaffolding pole that you were meant to sit on. I mean, it's too much information. I know, but it's a nightmare. Somebody fell in. It's just terrible stuff. And also, the thing about Wheelie was that we were so stupid that people just turn up at festivals with literally in a pair of flip flops, with 2 and 6 spending money and 10 Benson and Hedges, and never have any idea that it was going to get cold, it was going to get dark, it was going to get wet. Do you know what I mean? And some people didn't have any sleeping bags, and there'll be farmers selling old fertiliser sacks, 10p for a paper sack, which still had some fertiliser in it. I can remember you get in there, you apply the old. It's starting to rain, and I promise you, a paper bag isn't much good in the rain anyway. And all you got is your 10 Benson and Hedges, Atomic Rooster are playing somewhere on the horizon, and a pair of warm and fragrant feet get put against the bottom of these bags, which are still full of kind of highly charged fish meal fertiliser, and a terrible noxious yellow gas comes out, ripping the bark off trees. So I mean, to move forward to 1976, I mean, festivals had got a lot better, but there's still an element of suffering. And I remember thinking that the press were having a great time. These guys were getting in free, and they weren't having to queue up, and they were forking smoked salmon off cardboard plates and having a really good view of Tom Petty and the Heartbreakers. And I thought that would be quite a nice job. So that was another incentive, actually.
Now, I think it was a mother that took pity on you and your friend and actually drove you to the festival site, wasn't it? Yeah. And I think that there's a... maybe you want to read a little bit by that, because she starts when she says goodbye. She says, "My daughter's in there," and then after that, you kind of describe the scene. If you want to just read from "My daughter's in there," because I particularly this description.
We've just hitchhiked. This is another festival actually in Lincoln. And we've just hitchhiked up there, and this woman's dropped us off, and and she says, Yeah, damp hippies filed into its throbbing interior through turnstiles. You could hear the muffled thump of music. She turned off the engine. This woman would be about, I don't know, 38, 40. We thought it was a real old person, you know. Austin, Cambridge. A real knackered old, you know. And she turned off the engine. She stared through the rain-speckled windscreen, and she shivered. She said, "My daughter's in there," she said. Festivals in 1972 weren't thought to be good places for daughters to be. You might as well send them straight to the sacrificial altar. Local press gave the impression of vast orgies where teenage girls would be force-fed LSD and hurl themselves saucer-eyed into riotous sexual abandon with men who hadn't had a bath since Christmas. 10 minutes exposure to the sinister pulse of evil dream weaver's Hawkwind, and your virgin child would be brainwashed and spend the rest of her life on a houseboat full of dogs and babies, stirring vats of vegetable curry while someone played Silver Machine on a guitar over and over again, which only had 3 strings. So, yeah,
that is exactly the bit I wanted. I think it sums it up very nicely. So... you get, how long did you have to hassle, and how many pieces did you have to submit before you actually got the break with Elvis Costello?
Well, I suppose technology. I suppose I'd probably really been very lucky. I'd only been doing that for about 2 weeks. I worked in a bar and I washed dishes all day, and I went out every night and just saw bands. It was so hard to get in those days. Of course, there was no blogging, and people would say, say you want to write for us. What's your writing? They'd show me some of your writing, and if you hadn't been published, it was very hard to get the whole thing started, because unless you'd been published, they wouldn't have read what you've written, and so they got no idea if you're any good. And now, at least, you've got the chance to be able to self-publish, and you can direct people to what you've done. But I mean, my idea, because I couldn't think of a better one, was to simply go out every night and see bands that I thought were interesting and write an unsolicited review and hand them in, type it out, hand-typed every night, and, 2 copies, one for the Record Mirror, one for the NME, in the hope that one of them might actually publish it. And eventually that's what happened. I mean, it was the Elvis Costello thing, but also I wrote about a group called Echo and the Bunnymen, and they were just, suddenly everyone was getting interested in them. And Teardrop Explodes, and so they were going, gosh, we need, this group sound really interesting. Oh, that idiot who comes in every day with these unsolicited, didn't he write about the Teardrop? Well, let's publish that. It might be, maybe it'd be all right. So that was the only way I could think of doing it. But once I got my foot in the door, I was in there and got regular kind of review work, and then I started working on the news desk, and then very occasionally you get to do features, very exciting, and little news stories. And
what was the first feature that you wrote?
First feature I wrote was, to my eternal shame, was a group called Nazareth. Sorry, actually, they're Scottish, so not to my eternal shame. The Mighty Nazareth, let me reframe it. Manny Charlton, am I right? And I thought it was terribly fabulous, because I was actually, this is really interesting, I haven't thought about this for ages. I was rung up, and in those days, the music industry was just so kind of wealthy. I mean, I remember being rung up at, I'd only been at the NME about a week, and somebody rang up and said, "Are you interested in XTC?" Which I was, very, very, I thought it was fantastic. He said, "Do you want to come out on the road to America and just spend a week with the guys, eat a bit of barbecue, drink some beer, get to know them? You don't have to write anything if you don't want to, but if you feel like it, write something." I didn't actually go because I was doing something else, but, it was incredible how much money there was. It was extraordinary. And this was just, actually Nazareth were very much on the way down, because punk rock had been on the way up, and punk rock had fairly effectively taken people like Nazareth right out of the scene. And but I was flown on a private aircraft to their tax haven of the Isle of Man. I can remember it being so... Anyone remember a program called Stella Street? It was fantastically funny. Stella Street was John Sessions, wasn't it? And they're impersonating. It's the idea that all these rock stars just live in a... Keith Richards and Mick Jagger run the corner shop, don't they? And called Some Like It Yacht, isn't it? For all your chandlering needs. It's just so funny. I remember it really well. And then I think I can't remember, all sorts of famous actors live there. But it was like Stella Street being on this place, because I remember getting out the plane, going onto the main road to meet the members of Nazareth, and out of the door, next door to them, came in 3 separate houses, 3 members of Status Quo, just coming out, getting, "Oh, all right, mate," getting their bottles of milk. So this was just a kind of tax haven where old rock and roll stars lived. It was just bizarre, and I thought it was really glamorous. And I came back and said, "Oh, I've done my little piece on Nazareth," and everyone was going, "Oh, we're doing the Buzzcocks. We're doing a certain ratio. We're doing Crispy Ambulance. We mean Nazareth. They're still going. I thought it was really brilliant."
And did you? I mean, when you went to interview them, did you Did you go there with a kind of attitude that you're going to take the piss out of them, or were you a fan?
Well, you were put under a lot of pressure by the editorial to take a slant. You know, I mean, the enemy made a lot of hay and had a lot of commercial success out of being incredibly cruel to the old guard and incredibly enthusiastic about the new guard. They used to call it barbecuing the dinosaurs. And so all the old guard, Brian Ferry was the classic example. Everyone at Enemy had a sort of some kind of meeting, to which I don't think I remember being invited, but they decided that Brian Ferry and Roxy Music represented all that was awful about the world, and they must be got rid of. And so they decided Brian Ferry was no longer referred to as Brian Ferry, he was known as Byron Ferrari, a kind of sports car steering faux poetic lounge lizard, spilling Campari all over the place in a velvet jacket. It was hilarious. Byron Ferrari. And actually, it did Roxy Music quite a lot of good because it gave them a lot of profile, and you know, a lot of people who really liked Roxy Music felt quite defensive about them. But you were allowed, I mean, if you wrote Brian Ferry and copied, the subs would change it to Byron Ferrari. So it was quite interesting because they really, I can remember writing about some terrible old groups like Wishbone Ash and people like that. I mean, told, you've got to stitch them up, mate. Hatchet job. Remember the expression, hatchet job.
Did you do that? Did you barbecue Wishbone Ash?
I didn't know. I'm trying to think. I was a bit unkind about a few people. I'm trying to remember now. But I tried not to, because also I'd been, it sounds a bit pathetic, I've been an amateur musician myself, you know, I've been in the school group, and I kind of understood what it was like, you know, and I thought it was a bit unkind. Somebody's put all this effort into producing this set, and they're giving it their best shot, and for some complete tosser from New Music Express to come along and puncture their balloon seemed a bit mean, really. So I don't think I was really that aggressive kind of, that's why I never really, the magazines I went on to edit, I don't think really had that aggressive kind of tabloid slant to them, really.
Are there any ones that you feel particularly bad about barbecuing or being horrible about?
No, I wrote something very unkind about the Blue Oyster Cult, but I mean, I think they'd had their moment in the sun and they wouldn't have read it anyway, and for God's sake, if 300 words from Cub reporter Mark Ellen's going to make any difference at all to their trajectory, then they really are in trouble, I think.
So you after NME, you went on to write for Smash Hits. Were you writing for both of them at the same time, or did Smash Hits just bring you into as a kind of staff writer?
Well, I was working at the NME, and I didn't really, I mean, I wrote 3 chapters about it in the book, actually, because it was so interesting. It was an incredible time to be there. I mean, it was just, they sold 250,000 copies a week, and 3 or 4 people would read each copy. 1 million people, you wrote something, 1 million people would read it. And so this bred these amazing egomaniacs, these nutters, wandering around the place full of their own importance, which I thought was quite amusing, really. But I didn't really feel I fitted in. It was, yeah, people say, I saw Tony Parsons the other day, who I worked with, we were talking about how rock and roll it was. And it was rock and roll. I mean, it was, you know, I remember working in the news desk and somebody not turning up for work. I said, what's happened to him? He said, he's OD'd, mate. He's OD'd on methadone. And it's terribly disrespectful to say, the poor old guy died. You know what? That's a pretty good excuse for not being at work. Died of a drug overdose. And we said, everyone just shrugged and just got on with work, you know. So, unlucky. Yeah, unlucky. But what a downer, you know. We just put another sheet of paper in the typewriter and started carrying on. I thought, actually, this is ridiculous. So I went, when I left, I actually worked for an underground magazine run by a guy called Felix Dennis, a very, very flamboyant and maverick publisher who died very recently, actually, who made a huge amount of money. And we produced a kind of underground, kind of real old school 60s thing called New Music News, which was really good fun. And that folded, and then I started working for Smash Hits. And that was an extraordinary change because the NME was in Carnaby Street, in this kind of rather dour place. And we looked down from the Smash Hits window across Carnaby Street into their office. We looked down in every way, we used to feel, actually. And there they were, still struggling with their kind of political stuff about the Redskins and all these bands that was all very black and white. And what had happened is that an incredible boom had happened. Video had occurred and all these bands. It's really interesting, the bands I used to write about, like Dexys Midnight Runners, Human League, you know, Adam and the Ants, Gary Newman, you know, all those bands had suddenly completely reformed to attach themselves to the video boom. They were all quite worthy, you know, quite credible groups working in little clubs, and suddenly they'd turn into pop groups. Adam and the Ants were no longer a punk rock band playing in the Vortex. They were making records for 14-year-old girls, you know. And actually, it was a very exciting time to be there because it was so much success. It was so colourful. And Smash Hits. Any Smash Hits readers here? Anybody remember Smash Hits back at the fantastic? Yeah.
Let me explain it for those for the young team. This was a magazine, right? And it would have your kind of newsy bits at the front, and then it would. I have to ask you about this because it really is odd. About half of it seemed to be taken up with printing lyrics of hit songs, but not like. There wasn't any sort of quality control. I mean, anything in the charts was the lyrics were in there, and then there'd be a couple of interviews with bands, a letters page, reviews, gig reviews, and single and album reviews, and then a kind of a gossipy kind of thing.
Right.
And that was it. And it was bloody expensive as well compared to other stuff, yeah.
Very expensive. Colour pictures. Did become cheap.
That'll be it, yeah.
Yeah. But no, we was there just to provide anybody who was not old enough to go out. You couldn't actually go out to concerts. You were still living with your ma and pa, hating your parents, really liking Boy George, and complaining about the fact that when Boy George came on Top of the Pops, your father would say, "Is it a boy or is it a girl?" Which is exactly what happened to me when I was a kid when the Kinks came on,
Well, I mean, the thing, the first time I read about the Dead Kennedys was in Smash Hits, so it wasn't all pop stuff as well. I mean, there was, I read an interview with Saxon, who I think they've been going since the early 70s, and they're still around. New British metal, or what was it?
Yeah, well, anybody who was in the charts basically was just about the charts. So you made no distinction between Adam and the Ants or Human League or ABC, who produced beautiful records, I thought, or Renee and Renato, or Bonnie Tyler. Yeah. The big-haired disco longsmith, I think we used to call her. We just invented names for everybody. It was a very funny time because, all of us were kind of too old to be doing it. And I suppose I would have been about 28 or something, or 27. And Neil Tennant, who was the assistant editor with me, and he went on to be in the Pet Shop Boys, just a fabulous guy to have there because he just so loved all that kind of campery. It was a pretty kind of camp time, all those bands all dressed up in these ridiculous clothes, And his first week, we sent him on the road with a group called Kajagoogoo. If you remember them, Limar from Kajagoogoo. And he came back and I said, "How was he?" He said, "Oh, the noise, the people." It was just really...
Great. And can you remember the first feature you wrote for them, for Smash Hits?
Yeah, well, actually, it was about the Flying Lizards, which isn't very exciting. The Flying Lizards had a cover of a version of a song called Money. Was it Money? Yeah.
Yeah, it was, yeah.
Money. Do you remember that? Quite a good version. And then after that, I did Sheena Easton. And that was hilarious. I was still kind of thinking I was at the NME, and I was asking all these really challenging questions about, she had a song called Modern Girl, another one called, 9 to 5, I think it was.
That's it,
and Modern Girl has that very kind of slightly feminist lyric. It was all about, taking control of your life and not letting some bloke boss you around, And I thought this was actually quite interesting, and I was asking about how to, and she basically said, "Look, I don't write these songs, I just sing them, so just get over it and calm down." I was going, "Well, okay." So, I remember she said, "Do you want to know my favourite food?" And so trotted out that she liked jam sandwiches and whatever it was, crisps or something. And her pet hates were spiders in the bath, that's right, and I can't remember, rain or something. I was thinking, God, this is weird, because I've been at Smash Hits, at NME, only weeks beforehand, where you were talking about Kierkegaard and Karl Marx and storming the barricades and, how we could plot the assassination of Thatcher. If Thatcher was there at the time. Probably wasn't actually, it was probably pre-Thatcher.
And, I mean, did you have to adapt your interview style pretty quickly then, or did you
I thought it was really fascinating because, to be honest, to make a kind of serious point about it, the enemy was, you couldn't please them. You could not please the enemy at that time. There was no question they asked seemed to have the right answer. No, they'd find their favourite groups and still somehow puncture this band and somehow find something wrong with them. And I felt that we should do the opposite. So I invented a series of questions for Smash Hits, to which I felt there was no wrong answer. And so you'd start a question by saying, have you ever felt like a roundabout? Or what colour is Tuesday? That used to be the opening question. So you say to Toyah or Phil Oakey of the Human League, tossing his peculiar half mane of hair around. You say, Phil, what colour is Tuesday? And that sounds a really ridiculous question, which it is a ridiculous question. But actually, I thought it was a really good question, because it often led to a really interesting, a really revealing response, because people didn't feel threatened, And they'd say, purple. Why purple? Well, my favourite colour's purple. And I met a girl once who was wearing a purple skirt. We fell in love, and we were only 16, and we went to a club, and some story might develop, And so I thought it was quite good. Have you ever been sick in a gumboot? Was the other one. Which is quite funny. Because the new, if you ask Nick Rhodes of Duran Duran, have you ever been sick? It's okay. But once you ask Phil Collins, or because Do you know what I mean? Or a member of ZZ Top, or, you know, whoever, David Bowie or something. Have you ever been sick in a gumboot? They thought this was a bit peculiar, really.
How did they react? I mean, did you get kind of hostile reactions from some of them?
Well, no, I mean, I think what happened was Smash Hits was so successful. I mean, it was selling about, I don't know, 100,000 when I started, and when I left, we were selling nearly 600,000. We went on to sell 1 million. So it was so huge that the industry and the PRs put a lot of pressure on their artists to talk to Smash Hits. You can go and talk to NME till the cows come home, but it probably weren't selling any records. You know, this is, by the way, before the press itself latched onto pop music, which happened in about 80. It happened with Boy George. Boy George was the complete turning point. Boy George and Culture Club was a major moment. I think I was there. I mentioned this in the book. I think I was there at the moment when the press discovered pop music. Because up till then, you got to remember, music was only written about in news stories. Because something terrible had happened with a Mars bar and Marianne Faithfull in her house, and you know that was a kind of a headline, it was a news story. You know, Bob Dylan had been terrible at only played for 45 minutes at a festival in the Isle of Wight. You know, that's on the news pages. It wasn't in the context of a music review. But Boy George turned up at this thing and he just got a single out. Do You Really Want to Hurt Me? Culture Club's, I think, first single. And he was just fantastic. It was an amazing event, a music business event hosted by Princess Margaret. It was hilarious thinking about that. Princess Margaret, a massive old soak who, there was a rule where you weren't allowed to smoke till after the speeches. And she's just a chain smoker, you know. So she just suddenly got up. We hadn't even had our soup. She suddenly got up and said, "Oh, welcome to this. And I'm so pleased about British exports abroad of marvellous pop music." And sat down and lit up a cigarette, you know. Because she was then allowed to smoke, she just made her speech, you know. So the whole thing was really chaotic. And then Boy George kept stumbling in with a bright crimson stovepipe hat. And he was a substantial figure even then. He's about 6'2", pretty well built, statuesque looking chap with huge long dreadlocks and a skirt basically. And the press just couldn't believe it. And there was a thing saying ladies and gents. It was in the Grosvenor House in central London. And this marvellous pantomime where he sort of careered between the ladies and the gents, sort of do this kind of, which one? Decisions. Oh, I don't know, confused, you know. And the press just thought, whoa, who is this guy? He's fantastic. Everyone loves a pantomime dame, don't they? There's no harm in them, you know, just wonderful, wonderful. So they started writing about Boy George and readers started picking up on it. And then what happened was Live Aid came along. And Live Aid completely cemented the relationship between pop music and the press. At that point, all the press started doing it. You know, the Mirror and the tabloids started running gossip columns about what pop musicians were up to, and most of the broadsheets started running review sections, and then the whole thing began with covering pop music. And we developed things like Q Magazine and Mojo, in fact, and Select.
Now, before we move on to Q, I mean, with these lyrics, did you actually have to pay to publish those, or were the publishers quite happy for you to?
You paid a lot of money. Huge amount of money. I mean, it was £300 or £400, which is a huge amount of money actually. You think for the lyrics to a Bonnie Tyler song. You think it's really
did it vary
steep,
then?
You know?
So was it Bonnie Tyler?
They were spelt wrong because they never bothered to check them. You just type out any old rubbish and to prove that they had the copyright.
So did they read them?
So we had one of the girls in the office. Her job was to go through and make sure Boogie Oogie Oogie was actually, we had the right number of oogies in there, or else readers would write it and say, "I think you'll find it's actually Boogie Oogie." You know, so it got very complicated. Really.
And did you pay more for a Bonnie Tyler song than say
No,
a
they're all pretty
Saxon
much standard amount. But lyrics were a very important part of it. My theory was that if you were a teenager buying singles, then you had the groups on top of the pops, and you had smash hits with its lyrics and its pictures and its gossip and its interviews. And once you heard that music on the radio, or you bought the single, it would connect up, if you like, a little electrical circuit of fairy lights, and the whole thing would come to light, because you weren't old enough. And once people became old enough to go out to concerts on their own, they stopped buying smash hits immediately. Then they started buying the NME, and they kind of got into that kind of angsty kind of late teenage thing.
And with the readers, did you find a lot of the readers that started with smash hits gravitated then onto Q and other magazines that you were involved with? Yeah,
well, I did find that because smash hits readers, they would be, 14 or whatever. Then by the time we launched Q in 1986, I think, and so they'd be 18, 19, 20 and be reading Q, and then we launched a magazine called Mojo. bit later, probably around early 90s, and a lot of people gravitated to that, which seemed to be a natural thing. By way, actually, of another magazine, or did it come out afterwards, that one called, because Select, actually, which was before that. Select was a good... Anyone read Select or remember Select? It was a kind of independent... it was really good, I thought, actually. I was really quite proud of it. I went back and had a look at some old copies when I was writing the book, because I wanted to write about what it's like feeling... kind of completely washed up. I was 36 years old, I think, when I was the editor, and we bought it from another company. I checked it, and it came complete with a staff of people, and they were really fascinating because it's the first time I'd met people who didn't like the Beatles, and they didn't like... There's one guy called the Terminator Hicks, who was the graphic designer. He was only known as Terminator. He wouldn't answer to anything else. Steve, I just had to call him Terminator. And he would listen to what he called bleep tapes. And again, I didn't really know anything about electronic music. He just made these little tiny bits, which is the most terrifying music. This sort of computer-generated, queasy noise which sounded like a sort of spin dryer full of bricks with a weird electronic, like a malfunctioning fire alarm going along the top. It made me feel really old. I quite like music she listens to, probably. Oh yeah. Oh right, but I actually really like that music now. But at the time, I'd never heard anything like that, and so I was in a world where these people hated the Beatles, and they also hated music with any lyrics at all. They didn't like singing, they didn't like lyrics, and they didn't like guitars. So it was weird. I remember saying to the Terminator, "What do you do if you find you're listening to something that's got guitars on it?" So I'll take the CD off, where it was, a cassette off, and said, "I'll kill it to bits. I'll kill it till it really hurts," he said. So I thought, I was really quite shocked because, it really made me feel really old. I was 36 years old. I thought, I've had it. I've lost it. I might as well just give up,
Could you not relate to the destruction side of it? As I remember, there's a scene where you was using a Phil Collins record for target practice. Your flatmate had a gun.
Well, I was actually one of the participants, and this is actually in the audience tonight. It was one of my old pals, Julia, in the front row. We were living in this house, and can I tell the story? Is that right? It's just so awful, really. But it's just it sounds so bad. But when you're a reviewer, you got all these free singles, obviously, and you reviewed them, and you would then usually sell the ones you didn't want to keep. And so we'd go through the singles. This is when I was at New Music News. I was living in this terrible old squat in Hackney, and all sorts of people, very interesting people actually. Anton Corbijn, the photographer, was there, and anyway, an old friend of mine called Tom Hibbert. Tom Hibbert went on to be quite successful at Q magazine. You probably remember him, an amazing writer. And Tommy was there, and as was Julia, and a friend of Julia's who had a very powerful rifle for some reason. And so we invented this game. Tommy and I invented a game called Clay Pigeon Shooting. So what we do is we get the singles back when we'd review them, and then we'd take out all the ones we wanted to keep, the Cramps, the Fall, the stuff that we love, the B-52s, and all the real shite we would take down to the bottom of the garden. One of us down there, so one of us have a gun, the other one would go, pull, and up would go a copy of, Kiki D record. Fantastic reload, stick it in another shell. It was a very long gun. We'll have to have the brick walls. I don't think we were endangering anybody's life. We thought this was hilarious. And we, In the Air Tonight by Phil Collins, which actually now I'm a bit older, I actually don't think it's that terrible a record. But at the time, we thought Phil Collins was everything that was bad in the world was Phil Collins. And so, the real excitement was, anyone could hit a 12-inch, but could you hit a 7-inch of Phil Collins? Which took a lot more accuracy. So you'd start with a 12-inch, up it would go. Which goes ridiculous, because if you sold them, you get £4 for it, which you could probably live on for a week. So it's quite an exexpensive luxury of a game.
Clay pigeon shooting's expensive.
I'm just showing. But I was quite interested because when I've told people that story in the past, it's become a big debate about what would be the most satisfying record to shoot. And one of the records we shot, I think it takes a lot of beating, actually, because I genuinely think it's the worst record ever made. It's a record called Sexy Eyes by Dr. Hook. It's just... You agree? Well, I hope you haven't got a copy of it. No, okay. It's just a shocker, isn't it? And the feeling, I can't tell you, the feeling you get throwing a copy of Sexy Eyes by Dr. Hook up in the air and then just smashing it into smithereens with a very powerful gun. It's a beautiful feeling.
There's a guy that drinks in my local that plays with Dr. Hook. And I've been around his house.
Still going?
Yeah, he's
I thought I'd shot all their back catalogue.
We could go and shoot him if you want.
It's even better version of it. You throw live members of Doctor Hook up in the air. It should make a good television programme, wouldn't it?
Getting all these things smashing.
It's a brilliant idea.
Shooting.
It's a brilliant idea. You could win the chance to shoot the record you most loathed. And there could be a debate deciding what that record should be.
Probably one of my own.
Oh, yeah.
So when you were interviewing him, do you think that the relationship developed with the artists? I mean, did you become friends with them, or did you establish a kind of relationship which also allowed you to get interviews with them when you went on to do Q and Select that perhaps other magazines wouldn't have been able to get?
Well, that's a good question. If you got into journalism to become friends with musicians, I always felt that you weren't going to be a very good journalist, actually. A lot of people I was at the Academy with really, that was the truth. They really wanted to meet Joy Division. They really wanted to meet Bon Jovi or whoever it was. And you felt that they weren't writing very truthful pieces. The headline could have been, I think you're wonderful, let's go for a pint next Tuesday. You know what I mean? They weren't writing them for the readers. And I very early on realised that I did not want to become friends with musicians because it would completely compromise my view. You could be friends with them in the early days. And often, actually, if you were friends with people in the early days, when they became successful, they probably rather discarded you. John Peel spent his entire life moaning about the fact that he pretty much made the Faces and made Tyrannosaurus Rex and Mark Bolan. And once they achieved any success, they never ever bothered to even recognise him when he was in a room. So, that can backfire a bit too. But I don't know. I've only got a couple of musician friends, really, and they're people either like Neil Tennant, who I knew before they were a musician, or people whose careers have kind of got to the point where they've achieved all they feel they've achieved. I'm quite good friends with a member of Led Zeppelin. He's one of my neighbours, John Paul Jones, and a guy called Nick Lowe, fantastic musician. And they kind of feel whatever it was they were going to do, they've done it, and they're really enjoying just riding out these glorious careers, doing whatever they wanted to.
Did you ever do any interviews
with the press,
with people where you were starstruck or where you were meeting musicians that you'd idolised?
Well, I was very starstruck. There's a chapter in the book where, the structure of the book, I suppose, is that the very early part of the book, I'm just a fan, buying records and buying concert tickets and putting posters on my wall and sticking pictures of Julie Driscoll of Brian August Trinity on my satchel, and doing things that, and you don't have to. These are universal things, I think, sitting up all night, listening to, in my case, the Pink Floyd. I think it's going to change my life completely, and being in the school band and go to dances when I'm 15. And I think those are universal things. I'm hoping, it seems to be the case, that people are reading the book and thinking, well, I had the same experience, but I was listening to the Klaxons, or I was listening to R.E.M., or I was listening to whoever, Ed Sheeran, or I was listening to Tom Petty or something. So they are universal things. But the second half of the book, through the course of my career, through these magazines and through working in broadcasting, I got to meet pretty much everybody that I'd liked. And so one of the little mechanics in the book, which I quite like actually, is that how much the author, how much he's invested in these people, of his love and affection and time and money. And then when you meet them, sometimes I meet people, and there is a line in the book that seems to be now have escaped someone, is now rampaging across the countryside, which is my theory that there are two types of people in the world. There's people who like Van Morrison and people who've met him. So there are some people who can be really disappointing. But anyway, there was one really good example where there's a chapter in the book where I go to the Lake District to interview two huge heroes of mine. I used to adore this guy, Roy Harper, who made these great psychedelic folk records in the mid-70s. And Roy Harper's best friend at the time was Jimmy Page of Led Zeppelin. I used to love Led Zeppelin, and so I go off to... Shall I read a little bit of that?
If you set the scene and I'll find it in the meantime. Do you want to just put on your glasses and I'll find it? And you can, you've been, by this time you got a television career as well as a writing career, and you've gone off to the Lake District to interview your two heroes, and you find them with these two women half their age in an inn, and you've got a father and son film team. I've got it. If you've got to want to start it there, from Page and Harper.
I've got it from down here.
Excellent.
No, all you need to know is I've gone up to do this film for the Old Grey Whistle Test, and Roy Harper is 43 years old. And he's going out with a 19-year-old he's only met once. And Jimmy Page is on a blind date with her friend who's 18. So it's just hilarious. And they're really a little bit excited about that, going out with these people. One of these girls says to me, do you know Stairway to Heaven? And I said, I did, as it happened. She said, Jimmy wrote that. So I'm thinking, this is just bizarre. These girls know absolutely nothing about these people. But anyway, I say, there's a little bit here, I say, Page and Harper, we've gone along to they've invited us over to their place where they're having a meal at the back of this pub in Ambleside. Page and Harper presided over this bacchanalia like lords in the ramparts of a castle. All that was missing was some suits of armour, a spit-roasted deer, and a pike staff with somebody's head on it. Probably mine, actually. When either of them craved refreshment, a cry went up and a lowly factotum busied themselves delivering the tipple of choice. There were two gears to their recreational palate. If they shouted, "Red tackle," then generous goblets of claret were ferried their way. If they shouted, "White tackle," one of the serfs produced a small pouch of a potent powder, upended it on the tabletop and fashioned some lines for consumption. And the rest of us just sat there nursing our pints of Coniston Bluebird. Spectators on the sidelines allowed to bathe gratefully in the warm glow of some card-carrying rock deity. It was as if they cruised at a certain altitude, but had deigned to alight briefly on our lily pad and give us a glimpse of their glamorous world. Except it didn't look very glamorous. It looked a bit seedy and baggy at the knees. I gazed at Harper, and the scales fell from my eyes. I felt the tragic, heart-rending jolt of pain of a small child discovering that there's no Father Christmas, or that everybody mimes on top of the pops. I felt deceived and used and disillusioned. I've only put these stories in this book because they have, otherwise you could just tell a series of after-dinner anecdotes, but they're all there for a reason, you know. And this is the reason, I'm sure you've all had that. You know, you've met somebody in a luggage carousel at 5 o'clock in the morning who's your hero. They turn out to be really grumpy and uncooperative. So this is why I put this in here, you know. I felt deceived and used and disillusioned. The man I'd listened to night after night, whose canon I'd defended, whose soft hippie maxims I bought and adopted, whose songs I had painstakingly learnt on the guitar. Hang on, 2 hands here. Whose songs had ferried my son to sleep, seemed in real life to be an absolute arse. A grizzled, rancorous, crashing old bore with an ego that you couldn't possibly fit outdoors. And Page wasn't a vast improvement either. On close inspection, the dazzling guitar god of Since I've Been Loving You came across like a prized twerp, frozen in a changeless adolescence. So the evening, shall I read the last bit as well? So the evening rolled on. Red tackle! And fresh supplies would be rushed from the cellar. White tackle! And another massive mound of chop would be prepared. Trevor, who's the producer of Old Grey Whistler, Trevor and I munched our crisps and had another Bluebird. By 1 in the morning, the roof beams rattled to the sound of merriment and Trevor gingerly broached the subject of the filming. The crew were arriving at 8, he said. Was everyone happy with that? Strangely, they all seemed delighted. So that's sorted, he beamed. I'm turning in. I'll see you all at breakfast. Breakfast? Page looked horrified. Whatever breakfast was, he didn't like the sound of it. He'd assumed Trevor had meant 8 in the evening. And so had Harper. Used liberally, red tackle as a well-known sedative. But the same couldn't be said of their other favoured pick-me-up. White tackle brings with it many things, but the gift of sleep is not among them. They looked tight-lipped and ashen-faced. 8, Trevor said. 8 in the morning. There was an awkward, head-scratching silence while 2 men who'd never risen before the crack of noon pondered their fate. I tell you what, Page decided, and then he delivered the words that would chill the spines of even the hardiest film unit. We just have to stay up all night. I won't tell you what happens, but it gets worse and worse and worse. Actually, it's on YouTube. Somebody reminded me the other day.
Actually,
awful. You can
Mikey,
see.
if you want to tweet that link from YouTube, we can say you can have a look at it in your leisure time. And I actually went and I had a look at it myself. I had a vague memory of it being on TV. And
does it have the sheep in it or not?
It didn't really have a sheep sound in it, but you're saying that they dubbed the sheep in it afterwards.
It's awful, but the interview but they are so out of it. And we've fallen out. Basically what's happening before, it's just, I cannot conceal my disappointment at what a couple of absolute wankers these 2 guys are. And they think the same about me. Fair enough, you know, I seem to be this kind of guy representing the kind of 80s to them, which is actually was really untrue, you know. But they're going on about how much they hate Frankie Goes to Hollywood and all these new pop groups now, how absolutely talentless they are, and they're all got computers, they keep saying. And I go, oh, this is terrible. So I'm thinking, these guys I used to really love are so reactionary. I mean, you get a slightly more progressive attitude from my own father than you would have come from Roy Harper. So we've completely fallen out. And then at the end, we've got this sheep. Well, we're in Ambleside, the Lake District, and there's sheep wandering around this hillside behind us. And you could hear the sheep really loudly, you know. And so Jimmy Page and Roy Harper start impersonating sheep as if the sheep sound like someone saying my name, which they think is clever. So they go, Mark, like this, Mark. And it's just so terrible. And so this is how it ends. And at the most ignominious moment of many is when the producer rings me up a week later and says, I think we've managed to pull an edit together. I think it should be all right. I said, but we had to dub some sheep noises on. I said, well, why? He said, because they were making that noise, going, Mark. And of course, the joke doesn't work unless you could hear the sheep. We couldn't really hear the sheep loud enough, so we had to go to the BBC sound effects library and get an agricultural sounds album and dub some sheep. I was like, I just don't want to hear any more about this. It can't get any worse. So that's, I mean, everyone's had a low point in their career. I would say that possibly is one of many, actually. I've had a rich variety to choose from, but that's certainly one of them.
And it was funny because when I watched it, they seemed to have a fondness for you. They just seemed to be like the guys out of Spinal Tap, really. And
it's true.
Your interviewing style as well. You seemed a bit kind of nervous and not
terribly nervous. I was completely overcome. Because, it's something you have to get used to if you meet very famous people. I mean, if you carry on doing it for a living, as I have done, you kind of get inured to it, and you can cope with, completely understand what it's like. Once you've got used to the fact that David Bowie is tiny, or in fact, most people are much smaller than Mick Jagger, tiny. I mean, they're just a lot of often very tall people don't feel the need to seek attention. Actually, it's often people who are as tiny as David Bowie. Once you've got used to that, and you look at them and just think, "Gosh, that's that person I looked at, and that's all their mannerisms." You've just started to accept them as a kind of, hopefully, as a kind of a normal person with whom you can have a conversation.
Did you find that in print journalism it allowed you to even things out? So if someone was being a dick to you, you could actually get your own back in the piece. I mean, I was going through some old articles, and there always seemed to be stories of people being grumpy or giving really negative answers. And, in a way, when it came out in print, that was to their detriment, because usually they ended up looking like dicks.
Well, they did, and that's partly why I think the press started to shut down access, because they felt it was too high a risk, And I've never been that vindictive, actually. I mean, there are people. There's one episode of my book where I'm trying to make a point about U2, actually, and I'm not being too. I don't feel I'm being unkind, but I'm trying to make a point, because throughout the book, I'm being sympathetic and understanding about the predicament that pop stars are in. And I say I've spent 50 years examining rock music very, very closely. And there's not one single musician who I'd really want to change places with, because it's an extremely difficult thing to have to live with. And I make the point about Bono. And Bono, who I know is a controversial figure and rather divides opinion, but I really liked late period U2. I didn't like early U2 at all. I really understand their music. I like the Achtung Baby period. And there's a bit in the book where I travel on the road with them. And it's kind of interesting, because there's these wonderful philanthropists giving all their money to charity and stuff. And yet they've got this extraordinary thing where they're so wealthy. And they play a velodrome in Boston, which is a 21,000-seater venue. And I describe, just because it's an interesting thing to write about, actually, as a journalist, what it's like being in one of the line of cars, escaping from this velodrome. And they had this little game they used to play in each city. It was called Doing a Runner. They would see if they could break their own personal record, seeing how fast they could get from the venue into their own private Airbus 320 and into the air. And in Boston, they did it in, I think it was 6.5 minutes. And they have motorcycle outriders and police letting them run through the red lights. And it's an amazing thing. And also, they're in individual cars. So I'm just there with the Edge and his driver. And we're charging through these tunnels and down the expressways and out eventually to Logan Airport and up the stairs and onto this aircraft. And the aircraft is in the air, and they were commuting from New York. They have flats in New York, and they would just go out to work every day. Like anyone else would go to work on a bicycle or a tube. They would go on an Airbus 320. So the whole thing. And they'd been on the Sultan of Brunei's jet, which they'd borrowed recently, which had solid gold taps. It's just, the whole thing is just ridiculous. And I make the point about Bono that although it's fantastic, this life, he's stuck in this strange world where if he doesn't sustain the concept of Bono, he will not have the money to afford the luxuries of this world, which keeps him separated from the general public, and he might have to resort to something terrible like normal travel as opposed to first class. He might have to rub shoulders with his own, following, and also how very hard it is for him to. Most really famous people have a binary reaction, if you like. People either think they're absolutely brilliant and a completely uncritical adoration for everything they do. These film stars and all sorts of famous people, not just musicians. Or else they completely detest them and think everything they do is ripe for a pillory. And I made the point at the end that Bono appeared at... Do you remember Live 8? Remember Live 8, the 20th anniversary of Live Aid? Yeah. And it's extraordinary. Bono is chosen to start the broadcast, and they had all these big screens all over the country because they knew how successful Live Aid was. So this time they're ready. Huge screens in parks, Glasgow and Manchester and
Edinburgh.
Edinburgh, that's right. And Bono does this thing, you probably know his story. He's clicking his fingers and he says, and he's trying to get across the scale of the catastrophe that they're raising the money for in Africa. He says, every time I click my fingers, a child in Africa dies. And a bloke in Glasgow shouts out, well, stop fucking doing it then! And I'm just trying to make the point that, and I'm kind of sympathetic in a way, that whatever he does, there's going to be a large number of people who are going to misinterpret it deliberately and spin it into rich amusement, as indeed we are now.
No, actually...
Because we couldn't resist it.
Speaking of polarising figures, one thing that occurred to me and that I really wanted to ask, when I was reading that you were in a band with Tony Blair, and in fact you played all these gigs when you were at university together. I mean, when you became Prime Minister, were you ever tempted just to give him a shout and go, look, invading Iraq, bad idea, or maybe not replace Trident, spend the money on something else? I mean, did you ever get on the phone to him, or even on something like the New Deal for Musicians, and go, "Oi, Tony, come on, pal"?
No, I have to say, weirdly, my relationship with him is almost entirely about music. When I knew him at college, he had all sorts of dimensions to what he did, but I only knew him through the rock and roll side of it. We had this band, and I was in this group, and we used to tour. We had a band called Ugly Rumours, and we were absolutely shocking.
Do you ever take drugs with him?
No, I've been asked that question many times. When he was seeking election in 1996, 97, I did 3 or 4 very key interviews actually for him, because he asked me if I'd do them, and I wanted Labour to get elected very much, and I was fond of it. I thought I would do them, and they were the most pressurised things I've ever had to do in my life. One of them was on Newsnight, so it was a live interview on Newsnight. And you've really got to have your wits about you, because, of course, they're going to ask questions exactly like the one you've asked, which is how much drugs did you take and how often and what kind of drugs,
White tackle.
And you're talking about the guy, white tackle, red tackle. That's brilliant, yeah. And, the sad truth to the story is that he never did take any drugs. But you've got to get that across so forcibly that you're not giving the impression that you're covering anything up. It's quite complicated. I felt terrible. In fact, I eventually refused to do the interview. I said, I'll simply do a monologue. I'm simply going to speak, and you can just film that, and I'm not going to answer any questions, because I was so nervous about this thing going wrong. And but yeah, we had the group was very amusing. It would be too stressful to go into it in any great detail, but Tony Blair used to come on stage wearing a trumpet-sleeved T-shirt with a hoop neck and with 3 or 4 inches of bare midriff showing above his gigantic loon pants. We all look like that. We all do. It's terrible photographs. It was in the book with like a terrible long hair, and he's I know. The man in the front row here is actually stabbing his own eyes rather than try and visualise that. I know. No, it's bad. But and he used to come on stage. It's very funny because he was obsessed with Mick Jagger. I can't really do this. He used to come on stage, stand like this, and do a kind of. And we played an alternative college ball at Corpus Christi, and he came on stage doing that this Mick Jagger thing. But tread on this, and said, "Well, all right, Corpus Christi alternative college ball, are you ready to rock?" With his rather posh voice. And to be honest, I don't think they were ready to rock, but well, not to Ugly Rumours. I'll tell you that.
Okay. Well, I think that's a beautiful mental picture to have a little break on.
Nights, ahoy. Yeah. We've traumatised members of the audience here.
Yeah, I think. Thanks very much, Mark, for the first half, and Mark will be back.
Thank you very much,
Mark, too.